Hi, welcome to SharePoint Backups for the Unitrends Certified System Administration course. By the end of this module, you'll be able to determine which backup approach to use based on your SharePoint configuration. You'll also be able to configure and run a SharePoint backup using Unitrends best practices. First, let's take a look at determining your backup approach. How you back up your SharePoint, really is going to depend once again on your implementation of SharePoint and your data retention and your data recovery requirements. How long do you need to keep these backups for? And then really the biggest driver, as we've seen in the earlier modules, is how often do I need to run the backups? What is my tolerance for data loss? What is my recovery point objective? We're going to wrap these two around, of course, Unitrends best practices as we continue through this module for you. Now, once again, your backup approach really depends on how you've implemented your SharePoint. So when we start to break this down, once again, we do have a Unitrends SharePoint agent. By installing the agent, once again, on an asset that's running SharePoint, it detects the SharePoint application and the farm objects underneath. And now, once again, you have to check to make sure you're running the supported versions of SharePoint and the operating system. You're going to check that compatibility matrix first. Also, there's a special consideration if you're running SharePoint farms that are larger than 250 gigs. You may also consider running additional SQL agent backup jobs. Once again, see the KB article 1209 for more information on that. Once again, most of our customers, SMB customers, they're running much smaller SharePoint databases than 250 gigs. So once again, only a consideration if your SharePoint's larger than 250 gigs and you're having an issue backing it up. It may be larger but not change as often, and you're still okay. Once again, check out that KB article 1209. Now, it is an or option here. It's not an and or. You can either run the agents or run native backups. You can't run both. Okay, now native backups, you still have to run, once again, the Unitrends file level backups. The native SharePoint backups are going to dump out the flat file dump of the SharePoint information, and we're going to pick that stuff up with our file level agents. Once again, check to make sure if you have an unsupported version of SharePoint and OS combination there, once again, you're going to use that compatibility matrix. You're going to check that matrix, and if you have something that's not supported, you can still do native backups and then run our agent across that asset. Once again, running just file-level backups directly across an asset will not back up SharePoint. It's not going to give you the same results. Make sure you still run a native backup first. A couple of quick notes down there at the bottom for us, important notes. The first one is the Unitrends application agent approach is preferred. Right? Whenever you're running, we're going to go through some of the next configuration options, but whenever you can run an agent, it is our preferred method. And then once again, the same thing I pointed out earlier is that once again, you can only run one or the other. You can't run both of these. You can either only run the agent or native backups in our file level agent. They will collide if you try to run both. Now we start with our high level overview of SharePoint backup job and really kind of how it works. Once again, the tasker is going to initiate a SharePoint backup job. It's going to go into the queue and it's going to wait until the available resources are ready. Right? Once they're ready, the remote application engine, RAE, is going to check to make sure the Samba configuration file. It's going to check that Samba share configuration file, and it mounts the Samba share. All right, now, once that process is done, the client then tries to send data to that, that universal naming convention code, that path, that UNC path. Now, the security token service and PowerShell, they write the backup directly to the share. All right, through that UNC path. From Unitrends side, it reads from the share and creates the backup in a CTAR. Compressing tape archiver, a CTAR, it's an old term. It's not really writing it to tape, it's just a term. We use CTAR for our backup formats on Unitrends. Now, once that backup's done, the share is then cleaned up and torn down once that backup process is completed. The SharePoint application backup, it protects your SharePoint data, as we talked about in some of the other modules too. So depending on your recovery needs, you may need to configure other backups. Right, the SharePoint agent backup, it's going to get the content, the app DBs, the configuration database. It's going to grab the content files and the log files. Now, once again, if you're running any databases over 250 gigs, you may think about backing up the SQL objects separately as additional backups. We talked about that in a few slides previous. Now, if you are running a single server, you're running a single server instance of SharePoint, you can run the application agent backups across the SharePoint single server, and you can only do granular recovery from a full backup. And you can recover the entire backup back to the original farm only. You can't really rename them or put them to different servers or, do stuff like you can with SQL and Exchange. Pretty limited recovery for single server instance only. Now, you can configure additional file level backups if you need to, if you have other data on the server, right? We talked about that earlier too, or if you need, catastrophic recovery options on that server for some other reason. Really, once again, SharePoint, you really have to build the server from scratch and then restore your farm. But if you have other data on the server, you have other reasons to bare metal it, you can bring it back. You may have to even sysprep it to get SharePoint back installed. All right, once again, check your Microsoft best practices for protecting and recovering SharePoint. But now if you have a full farm, right, multiple servers, multiple, applications running on different servers spread out in a full farm, the SharePoint agent backup supports granular recovery from a full only. You can back up farm objects, and you can do granular recovery from a full backup using the Kroll OnTrack piece. That's a third-party software that allows you to go in and do granular recovery. Same thing you can do on the single server over there. It's a separate OEM licenses in some cases. Once again, check with your sales teams on how that's going to work for you. All right, but we allow you to mount those points up and go in through the Kroll application to recover individual objects and even the entire farm in some cases. Now, there are video tutorials on the Kroll OnTrack for SharePoint that you can watch in the video tutorial section on the Unitrends website and out there in the community in the support page. There's also one for Exchange. There's a piece for Kroll OnTrack for Exchange as well. Works almost in a similar fashion. There's video tutorials for both of those. Now, once again, if you have other data on that server, you can still run, register it as an asset and still run file level backups against it. And you can still bring that machine back. You just might have a challenge of bringing a SharePoint application back on that server. You may have to recreate it granularly from a Kroll OnTrack. Once again, there is no kind of one-time pass for a catastrophic recovery on a full farm. You kind of have to recover it in pieces, depending on how you back it up. And in most cases, you can recreate the farm and recover it granularly through Kroll OnTrack. Once again, because we don't do any kind of full catastrophic recovery on full farms or even single farms, we don't allow it to be moved to different servers, or SharePoint doesn't allow it to be moved to different servers. There is no instant recovery that's supported with SharePoint environments. All right, so any SharePoint server, might as well just take it off your list for instant recovery. Let's take a look at setting up your SharePoint backups. Now, to set up your SharePoint backups, you're going to need to, first of all, just like all the other ones, you're going to install the required components. You're going to configure your environment as you need to, right, depending on your SharePoint farm and the installation. You're going to make sure you consider, once again, your recovery point objectives and your recovery needs. Now that you know a little bit more about how your farm is set up, your backup method is going to change, right? Your backup approach is going to change. Now you can go in and take a look at your recovery needs, right? How am I going to back it up is going to kind of drive your recovery. And now it's just a matter of those objects and the farms, what are my recovery points going to be? Now, it also is, as we've talked about, it's going to be determined a little bit about your database size and the rate of change in your SharePoint environment too. That's going to help drive the backup types and jobs that you run as well. Once again, you always have to consider the storage and free space on the Unitrends system when you bring on new backups. Once again, you usually want to keep about 2 times the size, or make sure you have 2 times the size, because we're going to keep an initial full. We have to be able to get a new one as well, too, and the changes in between. With some deduplication, we just kind of request that you kind of look at about 2 times the size of the asset you're bringing on for anything. And this goes for SharePoint as well, too. All right, once again, we're going to also make sure we create the recommended backup jobs. Whenever we create an asset that we need to protect, we want to make sure we create those recommended backup jobs. Now, the install required components, basically, once again, we got to make sure we've installed the agent. We talked about it in one of the first couple slides there. You install the agent, and it automatically detects through the agent, through the SharePoint Central Admin, the CAS, right? It allows us to kind of see the SharePoint farm and the objects underneath the agent. All right, so we do have to install the agent. Once again, make sure you're running the latest version of the agent. Right, there is a kind of an agent release that you'll see in the compatibility matrix of when we started to support it. But once again, you really always want to make sure you're running the latest agent. When we take a look at configuring your environment, once again, you've got your user accounts, depending on how the component is set up and what component we're going to talk about here. We'll go through this list really quickly. Now, if your SharePoint environment and your user accounts are using CAS, the code access security, right? If you're using that to back up, then you have to use it to restore. And we require group membership for the SharePoint Farm Backup domain account member. It has to be part of the local administrators group and configured on each one of the nodes that you're going to use this application agent against. There is a KB article 1181 out there that you can check out for more information on that. Now we get down to the components for SP timer service and the SQL service. All right, the SQL service account. They require full control of all backup folders on the primary node. All right, so usually if you're running like a distributed farm for SharePoint, you've got a primary node, and that SP timer service and the SQL server account, the SQL service account, they require full control of all backup folders on the primary node. Once again, there's a Microsoft KB article 2814 that you can check out about more information on that SP timer service and the SQL service account. Now, the SP timer services and the SP administrator, now they got to be on the primary node, and they have to be set to running automatic startup. You want to make sure those things are starting up every time that server restarts, so those services are always running as well too. And they should be running at all times. For SharePoint 2013 and above, any user account which uses the STS admin and the PowerShell, you need to make sure that they have permissions to run the SharePoint backup and restore operations. Once again, there's a KB article 2814, the same one above, that talks about the SP timer service and the SQL service account. Same kind of KB article breaks down those different versions and those rights for you. All farm servers must be able to access the DPU's primary IP address. They must also be able to use the CIFS or the Samba share protocols, right? The NFS protocols. If you can't go to your SharePoint server and open up a File Explorer window and go back to your Unitrends appliance and see your Samba share, something's wrong. You probably won't get any backups. So make sure you can do that from all farm servers. They should be able to access the Samba share on your primary DPU, wherever you're backing these things up. They should be able to get to that IP address. When you go through and look at configuring credentials, now we're talking about Unitrends credentials here, and passing credentials through Unitrends to the backup operations. We have some different options and things you have to consider here. If you have a single server, single instance, pretty simple installation, usually uses the local administrator account, you don't have to define a trust credential at all. It just works based on the local administrator account. Now, if you do happen to define a trust, hopefully it's the local administrator account and you never ran into this issue. Because if you do assign one, it has to be local administrator rights to that single server farm. Now, if you have a full farm, You want to make sure you add the users created in the domain as the administrator on every server. Make sure you go to every server in the farm and add the users that you created in the domain for the farms to each server. You want to make sure you use that same trust then in the Unitrends system so we can back up that SharePoint farm database through the agent, through that same account that you created on that farm for that farm. You're going to pass that trust to Unitrends. All right, we'll see that in the demo portion a little bit as well too. I will show you how to assign those. Even though I'm running a single server farm, I'll show you how to assign them. They're pretty easy. There are additional considerations for SharePoint backups. You know, only one backup operation can run at a time. Right? That goes for restores too. Right? So if I'm running a restore and I have a backup kickoff, the backup's going to fail. And after any successful restore, whether I mount it for crawl on track for granular recovery or I restore the entire database back, my next scheduled backup will automatically be promoted to a full. So just be aware of that. You may go in to do something granular and you never did anything to the live database, never restored it out. But even if you mount a granular recovery, it's going to promote your next backup to a full for some reason. A few best practices for SharePoint backups. Once again, if that SharePoint database is greater than 250 gigs, you're seeing slowness in your differentials throughout the week, you may consider running additional SQL agent backups. There is a KB article, 1209, out there that talks about how you can run a different strategy against just your SQL objects. Once again, on a single simple deployment, make sure that the admin and the timer services are running as the local service and not using a user account. Some people go in and sometimes they set those to a user account for some reason or another. We want to make sure they're running as the local service. Our agent in our process has to have that running as a local service. Now, it's not impossible to perform item-level restores from SharePoint differentials using crawl. You just need to make sure you restore from a SharePoint full or a SQL backup. Once again, if you need more information on how the crawl application works and how you can do some of that stuff, there are video tutorials out there for best practices of SharePoint recovery using the crawl application. Big warning here for you. You want to make sure you don't perform any of the following when you're backing up SharePoint. You never want to add the SharePoint farm backup user to a group and then add that group to local admins. No nested groups. Don't add that group to a group and then add that group to a local admins. Don't want to nest any of the SharePoint farm admin stuff. You want to don't ever back up any SharePoint farm service as a VM. All right? You want to use the agent on really any SharePoint server, even if it's virtual. Don't ever back up any other SharePoint data directly, including databases or anything managed by SharePoint, including the web metadata. Once again, unless it's larger than 250 gigs, then you can maybe go after it directly for SQL to cut your backup times down. And once again, there's that KB article out there for you. You don't ever want to rejoin a server to a farm without a current timer index. The only way to restore a farm member is to join a new server to that farm. Create a new server, join that new server to the farm. But if you don't have the current timer index on an existing server that left the farm, don't ever rejoin it if you don't have that current timer index. Once again, never define any trust credentials for a single server installation. Unitrends won't be able to back it up. Once again, that's really not true. If you do assign one, it just has to be the local administrator account. But just once again, just best practices, don't even assign them. It works. Next, we're going to watch the how-to video tutorial on creating and managing a SharePoint backup job.